Today I'm going to take 21 RAW files taken with a Canon 600D and a kit lens, and I'm going to turn them into an absolutely massive panoramic picture with like 200 megapixels at the end, and I'm going to show you the entire process, all of the editing, and at the very end I'm even going to take the picture into Photoshop and add some stars in the sky. Big thanks to Skillshare for making this video possible. Skillshare is an online learning platform with over 15,000 structured courses about photography, photo editing, and much more. Check out the link in the video description to get your free 2-month trial today. Alright, so I'm here in Lightroom with my 21 RAW files that I'm about to stitch together, and this is a snow landscape in the city of Grindelwald. It's actually just a mountain village, not really a whole city, and I absolutely love this scenery. As you can see, I shot this at 80mm, so as wide as I could get with my kit lens, and I just also wanted this massive amount of detail. So before I stitch anything together though, I just want to go to my first picture, go to develop here, and go down into the lens corrections, because before you want to stitch anything together, you want to make sure that you remove the chromatic aberration, and also that you enable the profile corrections. Just choose your lens, and that will make sure that you don't have any distortion or vignetting that might throw off your whole panorama. Now after you've done these two things, you want to make sure that you have all of your pictures readily available, and go to the last one while holding shift, and that will select all of the pictures, and then you want to click on sync. Now theoretically you just have to make sure that the lens correction stuff is synced, but you can just check all, since these are the two only adjustments that you have done to the picture. And then the lens corrections as well as the chromatic aberration removal will be done to all of the pictures, and that is an absolutely essential role before stitching together the panorama. Alright, so now I've got them into every single picture. As you can see, everything is synced here. Now what I want to do is again select all of my pictures for the panorama and just go to one and go to the last one while holding down shift, select everything, then right click on any picture you would like, and then go to photo merge panorama. So now Lightroom has put together a preview, and as you can see, it's not a super great quality at the moment because it is just a preview, but what you have here before stitching together the final high quality panorama is all of these settings on the top right here. Now what you can do with these is change the alignment that Lightroom uses to stitch together these pictures, and depending on the style and the way you shot this panorama, it will depend what will work best, but I would just suggest you to try them out, and in some cases, as in for this photo right here or this panorama, you can actually not even choose anything because it won't find a way to align them together. So in that case, just stick with whatever works, and if you have multiple options here, go through every one and just go with whatever you like best. So then after these three options, you also have auto crop and boundary wrap. And if I turn off auto crop here, this is what it looks like, because it will just show the entire panoramic stitching process and everything that it figured out. So of course by stitching together a bunch of pictures, it will have to correct the alignment and distortion and so on. So you will automatically get a little bit of, stuff over the edges like this. So you can just click on auto crop and it will make sure that it selects the biggest rectangle that is possible without having to clone anything in Photoshop. But it's really up to you whether you want to click on that or not. You can of course always crop that later on in Lightroom as well. And then the last option that you have is boundary wrap, and it's going to be very important to talk about the boundary wrap here, because let's just show you, okay, with a zero boundary wrap, auto crop turned on, you can see the trees are relatively straight and everything seems to look great. But as I bring the boundary wrap to the right, it will actually, try to stretch the entire picture, and it will result in kind of the distortion, and the trees will become slightly crooked. Now usually that's probably not something you would want to do, but because I actually want to go for that look, I want to go for this wide angle look, I'm going to bring the boundary wrap quite far to the right. And again, if you want to have a perfectly close to how you actually saw a panorama, you want to probably keep that one at 0. But since I go for this artistic look, and I almost want this this super wide angle kind of look, just like I have right here, I think I'm gonna bring that to around actually 85. Again, completely up to you if you want to do that, but I'm just gonna click on auto crop as well as boundary wrap to 85 because I just think it works the best here. So after you've selected all of your settings, you played around with the boundary wrap and the auto crop, then you can click on merge, and that will merge the final panorama, the full resolution, and that will take again a little while. And speaking of it, it's finally done here with the panorama. Looks absolutely amazing, and as you can see at the top left here, 14,000 by 11,000 pixels wide. It's just huge, not quite 200 megapixels, but I believe it's around 160 megapixels, so still insanely huge. And if I zoom in here into 1:1, look at this detail, just unbelievable as far as you can see. And all of this, you know, the snow, these little branches, and all of that from a kit lens, an 18-55 kit lens. Just amazing what you can get by stitching together a panorama. But of course, it's nowhere near done yet, because we're just done stitching it together. Now we still have to edit it. So what I'm gonna do is go over to the develop tool here and close the history, because we're not gonna need that when I have the full preview for the picture here. And as you can see, lens corrections, we've already enabled all of that, so you're not gonna have to worry about that in the final picture here. But all of the other editing stuff, I haven't touched that at all. Now what I want to do first of all here, and I believe it's very important not to go overboard with it, because it is a very subtle picture, and as I mentioned at the very start of the video, I even want to add some stars in Photoshop at the very end, so I don't want to make this too bright. I kind of want to keep it at that kind of mysterious and gloomy overall look. So first of all, I do believe I'm gonna bring down the highlights a little bit just to equilibrate out some of the exposure in the sky. Then I do want to have a little bit plus shadows, although not want to bring that up too far, otherwise there's really a kind of contrast lacking, so around 30 here. Then with the blacks, now a lot of people will tell you to bring down the blacks, and by the way, what I'm doing right here is holding down the Alt key. On a Mac, I believe it to be CMD, but what it will show you is any of the clipped blacks, so black parts in your pictures that are just completely black, completely dark, and there is no information in them whatsoever. So what a lot of people will tell you is to actually go down and just clip some of the blacks, and you can definitely do that. It will give you a nice starting point for a pretty contrasty picture, but I actually prefer not to really clip that many of the blacks. So instead of going down, I'm actually going to bring them up and not have anything clipped in this case, but instead just bring the contrast a little bit to the right. And by bringing up the shadows, up the blacks, that will enable to bring you the contrast to the right, because in addition to just making things more contrasty, it will also make some of the dark parts darker. So by bringing the contrast to the right without having any of that, it can really make some of these dark parts a little bit too dark for my taste. So I think it's a really nice workflow to bring up the shadows, bring up the blacks, and in exchange also bring up some of the contrast. And with that being said, we're still left with absolutely no blacks being clipped. So that's pretty much in terms of the dark parts, at least in terms of the basics adjustments here. But now I'm gonna go into the whites, and whites is very, very important. Now, a thing that I would recommend is that you zoom in and actually pay most attention to the foreground while you move around this filter. Now, from 0 to just around plus 30 even, it is already a huge difference in terms of the dynamic and just interest. And the reason why you should look mainly towards the foreground is because the sky will automatically become brighter. It can work in a positive way, but if you have really an already very bright sky, it might not. But the sky is always very easily fixable with just a graduated filter, so pay most attention to the foreground. Now, I really love to bring that up, but I don't want to go too far, because by bringing it up, you know, like 65 here, it would just not work with the entire mood. So always try to amplify an adjustment in your picture, make it look a little bit better, but never go too crazy with it. So I believe around, yeah, perhaps just around 20-25 into the plus whites works actually pretty well here. Then going down to the clarity. Clarity is a very difficult and very important slider as well. Now, I like to generally go for a kind of high clarity in the foreground, because it makes everything very clear, very sharp, very textured, and then actually go for a low clarity in the background, because that tends to really help with the overall depth of the picture. It helps to kind of lead you from the sharp foreground into the distant, hazy background. So what I actually want to do here is just go for kind of an overall effect that looks good for the entire picture, and then further adjust them at the end with the local adjustments. But around, yeah, just around plus 20 clarity works pretty well for this photo right here. But also don't be too afraid to go into the minus, because it can work, especially if it's a very hazy and misty picture. So going further with the color temperature, now this picture is very, very blue, and if I would bring that up, it would just become a little bit too boring, because even though it might look more accurate, well, not really accurate, I would say something like this is probably what I saw in person. It was quite blue, but I maybe even want to go a bit further than that. So let's go around, yeah, around 5800 Kelvin here. It's very dependent from picture to picture, of course, and also completely up to your taste, but just go for whatever looks best rather than going for the, you know, most neutral look, because even if I would just grab this little pinpointer here, go to a white spot and let the auto white balance choose, this is not what it looked like in person. It might be the most neutral look, but it is definitely not what it looked like in person. So yeah, that looks pretty good in my opinion. Then tint, you can always play around with that one. And in kind of late day pictures, close to sunset even, I prefer to just put in a little bit of magenta tint, nothing crazy, just like 8 or 9. So after all of that, it's pretty much all that I want to do in terms of the basics. Now you can of course also play around with the exposure, and here I could go even further into this kind of night and darkish look, but I don't think I want to do that, at least not just now. And lastly, to the vibrance and saturation, you can play around with that, and especially in RAW files it can work to add just a little bit of vibrance and or saturation sometimes, because the picture right out of camera can look a little bit flat if you do RAW, but because this is already so blue and, you know, there's not a ton of color that I want to enhance here, I'm just gonna leave all of them at 0. Then going down to the tonal curve, I believe I'm just gonna play around with these sliders. Now the highlight slider kind of does a similar thing to the whites, at least if you bring that up, because the highlight slider in the tonal curve will just make the very bright parts brighter. So especially if you have kind of an overcast picture with some spots between the clouds, it can work, but other than that, I wouldn't go too far into either direction. Then the lights is a very broad brightness adjustment, so feel free to play around with that one. And the darks is kind of the equivalent for the lights, just in the dark areas, so not a very specific adjustment, just very broad in the dark parts. And lastly, shadows. This will adjust all of the very dark shadows, so if you want to have a little bit of extra contrast, you can bring that down. If you want to have some extra shadow detail, you can bring that up a little bit as well. But I think around, you know, just 0 is pretty fine here. So with all of these sliders, it's very dependent on picture to picture and on your style, so you really have to play around with them. But as you can see from before any of these adjustments to after, it's just a little bit more punchy, a little bit more interesting. Then going down, I'm actually not going to go to all of these tools, because even though I could certainly fine-tune everything with the HSL tool and so on, I don't want to go into such depth because it's a very, very small adjustment for a very large amount of time, and I think it's not so interesting because it's very, very dependent on picture to picture again. But split toning is something I absolutely love, and what I want to do here is first of all go to the highlights, go to this little box towards the right, and just play around with the colors. Because other than going into the vibrance and saturation and just enhancing already existing colors, here you can actually add new colors. And you can do that in a highlight manner, meaning that you can just add a certain color that is more present in the highlights rather than in the shadows. And you can do the same thing afterwards with the shadow parts as well. Now, as a general rule, I actually like to add some warm tones into the bright parts quite a lot of the times. And if I look at it here, I might even do that, but let's try to add a little bit of color with it. So going into the red tones, now I don't believe like purple or red itself will really work. So I will have to mix kind of a red with an orange, and yeah, I believe something like that should work pretty well. That way it will not only make the bright parts a little bit warmer, a little bit more close to how it would actually look like in nature, because of course the colors always come from the light sources, whether that is the sun or a lamp or whatever. So by just adding a bit of saturation, a bit of warm saturation, you make it look not only more realistic, but also more interesting, as it adds complexity and differentiation in terms of the entire color scheme. But I think I'm gonna keep it at a relatively low and reasonable level of around 20 saturation here. And speaking of the shadows, I'm also gonna go real quick to them and see what I want to do here. Now the shadows tend to be a lot harder and a lot less necessary, because again, naturally speaking, the colors are coming from the light and bright parts and not so much from the shadows. So just kind of use the shadows as a tool for some differentiation and some further complexity in terms of the entire color of the picture. And maybe just a bit of purple here, you know, just like 7% should work actually in my favor here. So before any split toning to after, just kind of helps to deal with the very severe bluish spot while still not going too far away from it, and it also certainly complexifies the entire color a bit. So going further into the detail tool, I always like to add some sharpening. Around 60 does the job pretty much all of the time, kind of a basic value I like to use. And then going into the masking, I always want to bring that to the right while holding down the Alt or again CMD key. And all that you see that is getting white means that this area is sharpened, and everything that is black is not going to be sharpened. So why that is important is because you don't want to sharpen the non-textured surfaces such as snow or such as the sky or water, because that will just introduce noise and it won't have any opportunity to sharpen anything there either. So don't worry if it's just a little spot of snow selected or whatever, it's not a big deal, but you just want to make sure that it is not completely white, but rather just, you know, looking something like this. Then going further into the noise reduction, now I shot this at ISO 100 and I don't believe there is very much noise at all, so unless you absolutely have to add noise reduction, I would actually recommend you not to do it, because even such a small amount as like 20 will really get rid of a lot of the sharpness, a lot of the crispness. And maybe it's not such a big deal in a huge panorama like this, but in any other picture where you really only have a limited amount of sharpness and detail, it will actually make your picture look a lot more kind of plasticky and just less good. Going down to the transform though, what you can do here is actually align everything and kinda, you know, just transform your picture. And for example, with the vertical transform, if I would go into the minus here, the trees become a lot more straight, a lot less crooked. So you can maybe say that is a better thing, but as I said at the very start, before even stitching together Panorama, I really love this wide angle look, and even though it may tilt some of the trees, and even though it looks less like a human would see it, I want to go for that look specifically for this picture. But if you don't, if you want to fine adjust something, perhaps also in the horizontal array, then you can do that in the transform tool here. So at least try it out, but you don't have to use it if you don't want to, of course. Going down to the effects here, pretty much the main thing is the vignetting, and I am going to add some vignetting because I want to make this a kind of darkish, gloomy picture. I think vignetting can really help, and the three main sliders with vignetting is the midpoint, which decides, pretty much if I show you the extreme example here, the midpoint decides how much vignetting is in your picture. Then the feather will decide how soft your edge is from the actual vignetting to the rest of the photo, and the amount is just how much you want to add in it. Now, I wouldn't suggest you to go too far because you can always adjust them into local adjustments as well in just certain corners, but I believe I'm gonna go to around -13 here, nothing crazy, but it does help with some additional attention on the center rather than on the corners, and it also kind of sets the mood. Alright, so after that you also have the haze and grain. Grain just makes your picture grainy, wouldn't suggest it at all unless you want to go for kind of a vintage look, and the haze is great if you have some haze or mist in your picture and you want to get rid of that, although I don't have any of that here, so I'm just going to leave it out. Now, going down to the camera calibration, first thing you have is the profiles, and I covered them in pretty much most of my videos, so this will just change your overall perception and look of your picture. It is very picture dependent, very user dependent, so I'm just going to skip over it, as I can't really explain you anything here. And the same is actually true with the primary colors, but what these will do is if you, for example, change around the red primary colors, it will also have an impact on the greens and the blues, as the greens and the blues are made out of a certain amount of the reds. So you can just fine-tune all of the colors, and I really love the primary color sliders for that the most, even more than the HSL tool and the top right here, because you can really fine-tune the overall hue exactly how you want it. Now it might take a little while and some, playing around between the hue sliders of the different red, the green and the blues, but at the end, if you really pay close attention to it and you kind of do something very lightly, you can actually enhance the picture by quite a bit. Now, if I look at the picture here, I might just want to make it a little bit less dark bluish, even though I do like the dark blue overall. And yeah, something like that, not quite as much saturation. And with the greens and the other stuff, now, as you can see here, because this picture is mainly really blue, the greens and the reds don't have such a huge impact, but if you would have a regular picture with a blue sky and a green grass field or something like that, it would have a much bigger impact. So I think I'm just gonna leave all of the red and primary color sliders at 0, except for the blues. And this one right here, I put a little bit towards the minus. So before any camera calibration adjustment to after, again, it's not really something I can tell you, go into the plus here, go into the minus there, because it's very, very dependent on picture to picture, but I hope I could at least explain what these primary color sliders actually do and what they're good for. So finally done with the global adjustments. I'm actually very happy with how this picture looks at the moment. So this is from before, and this is what we've edited the picture into so far. So it's kind of, it's still relatively close to the overall look of the starting raw file, but it is definitely more enhanced, more fine-tuned. If you just look at the foreground here, the snow just looks a lot more interesting, a lot more dynamic. Also, the blues isn't quite super strong as it was before. And also in terms of the shadow detail and everything, it's just a little bit more fine-tuned. Now Lightroom really struggles with loading this 160 megapixel file, but you can see it's not a huge difference, but it does have some very crucial fine-tuning in it. So with all of the global adjustments done, I think I'm gonna go into the local ones, And before I go into the graduated filter or anything else, I want to make sure I have the right crop. Now the great thing is that you still have all of the information to the right and to the left here, so you can freely move around that, and you could even go, for something like this and then take the picture into Photoshop and fill all of these white areas. But I'm gonna keep it simple in terms of that and go for a relatively, already done crop that looks pretty good. Now, if you look at it very closely here towards the right, you see that this tree starts to distort a little bit, as well as the tree towards the left. Now, this is just something that might happen if you don't shoot enough pictures towards the left or the right or up or down. You want to make sure that you shoot more pictures than you really need to, just to have that extra safety, but it's really not a big deal. I don't mind it so much, so I'm not going to pay too much attention towards it. And for the sky, I want to have as much sky as possible to add stars later on in Photoshop. But for the bottom, it's actually quite hard because I have this bridge, and because of the whole stitching process, this bridge turned out to be kind of distorted, but I actually don't mind it too much. So the other option would of course to be crop that out, but then it would almost become a little bit boring if you really ask me. So I think I'm just gonna go for this abstract artistic look, and at the same time still make sure I don't have anything white, but just something like that should really work, and I think it looks pretty good in terms of the crop. So after you have all of the crop figured out, you can finally go into the local adjustments such as the graduated filters. And the graduated filters, okay, so I'm not going to worry too much about the sky here because again, stars in Photoshop afterwards, but I'm still going to adjust some of the exposure on the foreground here by going a bit into the minus exposure. And I just want to kind of add some custom vignetting, closing out the picture here. So one over there, then creating a new one and actually dragging another one over the bottom right here. So you always want to make sure you angle it correctly and you add, of course, enough exposure difference or whatever effect that you want to have to actually see a difference. But at the same time, don't go too far. Don't make it look something like this. I get this a lot, I show an adjustment and some people just want to go way overboard with it. But keep it looking at least somewhat natural. Don't go too far with it, even if you like very heavy edited pictures. And maybe adding another one over here. Just me saying not going for too over edited pictures must be kind of silly because honestly, I do like very heavily edited photos, but yeah, I always want to keep it within at least sort of a natural and realistic framework. So, in terms of the bottom, I think that looks pretty good. Then going into the rail filters from some dodge and burning, and dodge and burning is making individual parts of your picture either darker or brighter. And first of all, what I want to do is go into the plus exposure, mix that with some whites and perhaps even some contrast. Now, I do believe that there is some massive opportunity for dodge and burning, but again, I don't want to make this too overdone, so I'm going to keep it relatively natural in terms of the amount of each filter, but I'm still going to right click and duplicate and then drag the filter over another spot. And with dodge and burning, you just kind of want to look at your entire photo. Where could it use a bit more exposure? Where is it maybe a bit too dull? So always use your creativity, but still go with the lighting scheme. Don't go into the darkest shadows and make them brighter, because that will just not look natural whatsoever, no matter what you try. Going into the plus whites here, right click duplicate, just so it looks like some light would have hit on the foreground here with the trees as well. And by the way, you always want to make sure that you have your feather at 100 if you do any of these adjustments. Otherwise, you can see here it looks completely fake, so just want to make sure that it blends in into the rest of the picture. And also you want to invert the mask, because otherwise everything outside of the rail filter will get adjusted rather than inside of it. So I think I might add 1 or 2 more plus exposure filters. And the great thing with exposure is also you can add additional interest and kind of make your viewer's eye go towards a certain spot, because your eye always goes to the more bright spots first rather than the dark ones. Now, I think that's pretty much all I'm gonna do in terms of the darkroom burning, at least in terms of the plus exposure. So here's before, here's after. A little bit more interesting, but nothing game breaking. So just fine tuning this and this one right here. And I do want to add some minus exposure as well, because minus exposure is very important, because if you don't add any, it will just look kind of flat and boring. So you do need some of these dark parts, even though you might not want to clip any dark blacks, you still want to have at least a bit of dark in your picture. So right click duplicate, you can also just press your front / key and that will duplicate the filter as well. But honestly, I just prefer to click here, and there's only like 2, 3, 4 filters more, so it's gonna be done relatively soon. Now, yeah, a little bit in the very bottom here, you can really work together with the plus and minus filters, have one spot right next to the minus exposure a little bit brighter, but you always wanna, not go too far. So I believe that's pretty much it. Perhaps a very last one over here, kind of make this a little bit longer and in a vertical way. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Now, as I said at the very start of the entire editing, I said I really like the clarity to be more clear and kind of more clarity in the foreground than in the distance. So what I'm gonna do here is add another rail filter, but this time just with minus clarity, and really drag quite a big one over the entire background of this photo. So always, especially with minus clarity, it's very easy to kind of go overboard, and that will just make everything super soft and not very realistic whatsoever. So keep it within a rational and realistic framework, and then you can really use it as enhancement rather than just completely changing around your picture. And I might even add some more plus clarity just for the foreground to even have a more distinct difference from foreground to background, and that looks actually pretty good. So I think that's pretty much it in terms of all of the Lightroom stuff, but as I said, I want to go into Photoshop and add some stars in the sky here. The easiest way to bring your picture into Photoshop is just to right click on your picture in Lightroom, go to Edit In, and then Adobe Photoshop CC. So that will open automatically Photoshop itself and open the picture in Photoshop. And also, as soon as you have made any adjustments to your picture within Photoshop, then you can save it and it will re-import as an extra picture into Lightroom. Alright, so I'm here in Photoshop with my full resolution file. I also got another picture of just stars mainly, and this I took in another mountain village at like 5 AM. It was minus 18 degrees outside, but what I want to do now is of course take first of all this picture and put it in the same Photoshop file. So I'm just gonna drag that over and minus the other one for now. So this will automatically open it as a new layer, and as you can see it's much smaller than the panorama because this is just a single file, whereas the panoramic picture is of course many files and like 160 megapixels large. So now there are pretty much two ways you can go from here, and the first one would just be to click on Ctrl T, rotate your picture and make it larger, but because you make it larger artificially, you will get a much lower quality compared to the background. As you can see, this picture, all of the branches of the panorama are super sharp, but the stars become a little bit pixelated. So I would really only suggest you to do that if you wanna just print this very small picture, or if you're perhaps not working with a big panorama at all. But because I want to have the maximum quality at the end, I'm not going to do any of that. Instead, what I'm going to do is first of all, let's go to the blending mode before I go any further, go into the screen, and I believe I have to enable a layer mask because as you can see, screen makes the picture almost disappear even though there are some small stars barely visible. So what I'm going to do to make these stars more visible again is just go to layer on the top right here, go to adjustment layer and then go to levels and then just click on OK. And by the way, if you have something on screen that will just, blend in with the rest of the picture, but here with the levels you can adjust that. And as you can see, it adjusts everything right now, so you can just hold down the Alt key and press left click and it will just adjust everything that is done on the layer below. And as you can see, you still have some stars, but now we can actually bring them out a little bit more. And as you can see here, with the mountain being as low as it pretty much can, the stars still don't reach all the way up to the top of the sky because this is such a huge panoramic file. So I still have to press down Ctrl T, and I'm just gonna hold down the Shift key while making it a little bit bigger and make sure that it reaches all the way to the top. Now this is again not ideal because it makes your stars artificially bigger and loses some quality, but we only did it a little bit, so it's not quite super bad. So now what I'm gonna do is bring that one all the way to the left here, then I'm gonna click on Ctrl J, have another one of these things, another one of these pictures, the exact same copy. Then again, click on Ctrl J, this time bring it also to the right, and you want to make sure these line up at least somewhat nicely, because if you don't, then it will just overlap, and I'm gonna put that all the way to the right as well. So now we have pretty much stars in the entire sky, and it looks pretty good. It looks definitely pretty good. So what I'm gonna do now, actually what I notice right now is that I have messed up by stacking two pictures on top of each other in the top left here. So what I'm going to do is just delete that one layer, so there's only one picture on the top left. And now we're left with 4 layers with 4 different pictures covering the entire sky. But because I want to have all of these layers in one now for further editing, I'm just going to select all of them and then convert them into a smart object. Alright, so now we have our smart object. Again, I'm gonna go into screen blending mode here, and what I'm actually also gonna go is to, again, layer, new adjustment layer, and go to exposure, and that is so I can change the exposure for the stars so they're a little bit more visible, and I just want to add a little bit of plus exposure so all of that is a bit more visible. It really doesn't have to be too crazy. But yeah, I think something like that should work pretty well. And I believe that actually looks pretty good. Again, all of that here in the front on the trees is of course going to be removed. But just for the sky, it looks pretty good. Of course, I'll have to get rid of this, I don't know, whatever that is. But I think other than that, it looks pretty darn good. And what I'm gonna do now is go to my smart object, add a layer mask to it, and make sure my color, foreground color is black. Then go to add a brush. And I want to have a relatively big brush, like 3000 pixels. Hardness should be at 0, so everything looks very natural. And the opacity you want to have at 100. So now I'm just going to paint over all of the foreground stuff and get rid of all of that and make sure, that the trees actually look like trees again. So you can do that, of course, also with other options. You can use the lasso tool and so on. But because I don't want all of the stars to be until the very, edge of the trees anyways, I don't really mind doing the entire process like this here. And if you would really want to go super specific about it, you could also make sure that you don't have anything in between these branches selected and that there are still some stars in between those as well. But I'm not really, it's not really that big of a deal for me. And what I'm gonna do now is actually make the brush even bigger to 5000. And now I'm gonna bring down the opacity to like 20, 30 around, and just make sure that the top looks not quite as strong as the bottom. And it takes a while to process because this is such a huge file, but at the end, if you're really doing it carefully, you should end up with a really nice picture. So again, a little bit more here, And I think that is pretty much it. So let's zoom in real quick before I go back to Lightroom. And as you can see, we have this nice graduation. It doesn't look overdone. Perhaps I'm gonna go to the levels again and just kind of fine tune everything a little bit more. Perhaps also go to the exposure that again just affects the stars and not go quite as far with them. But yeah, something like that seems to work pretty good. So what I'm gonna do now is actually something a little bit scary, and that is just to close the picture. And do you want to save? Yes. So what it will do is just save all of the pictures and automatically re-import them into Lightroom, which is a great thing because you don't have to worry about any Photoshop file somewhere. You really have everything just in Lightroom. And I'm finally back in Lightroom here with the final pictures with all of the stars. Now, as you can see, all of these settings have been reset, not because they actually have been reset, just because this is a separate picture imported from Photoshop. So the original RAW file stitched together still has all of the settings as they were before I exported the photo into Photoshop. But what I want to do now is just refine the entire picture, because even though I said that I didn't really want to crop out this bottom of the bridge here, I do believe I actually will do so, and not even to get rid of it so much, but mainly because I want to have more attention on the actual stars, and it would just kind of be a little bit over the top if I would leave that in. So I think that way it really pushes you into the picture and automatically has more sky as well. So that's kind of what I want to go for here. Also, I'm gonna add another graduated filter, or perhaps even a few, one over the bottom right here to make it even a little bit darker. And you know, I just want to make this kind of a little bit more gloomy, close out the picture, especially from the bottom here, and go also a little bit into the minus exposure with the bottom left. Then I'm gonna go back to the global exposure and just bring that down ever so slightly, and also the entire vibrance. I think I'm just gonna go around -7, -8. You're really nothing too crazy here. And at the same time, I'm gonna grab a relatively big graduated filter over the sky, and I just want to increase the contrast a little bit, make it also a bit darker, especially from the top, and bring down the blacks a little bit as well. So again, nothing crazy, but just a little bit more refinement, perhaps a bit less into the saturation, and also make the color temperature a bit warmer. So that's pretty much all I want to do in terms of the looks, but I do want to get rid of some of these lines here. I don't know, this was probably a satellite or something like that. And of course, because I repeated this picture 4 times, there will be 4 lines in this photo. So I just want to get rid of some of them by making sure I am in the spot removal tool here. Also gonna get rid of this one right here. It's very fast, and let's see, does that the job? All the way to the right there is still one, but I honestly don't mind that one too much. So let's just get rid of this line towards the left. And by the way, you can just hold down shift and you will get a perfectly straight filter. So that's kind of a nice quick way to get rid of straight objects. And with that being said, I think I'm pretty much done. There is an ugly sensor spot, so let's get rid of that one as well. And with that, I'm gonna say that I'm done. Now, keep in mind, this is just one of many possible edits, and you know, I could have edited way more heavily, gone for a more darkish look, and I definitely could have brought out the stars way more than I actually have, but I just kind of wanted the stars to be an extra and not really something that overpowers the photo, because it isn't night and it is still kind of bright out, so it really should be very subtle and very non-overpowering again. So yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of the photo, and at the very least I hope you learned something about stitching together panoramas and you could take something out of it. And speaking of learning, Skillshare is an online learning community with over 15,000 courses about photography, videography, design, and much more. Now, the really cool thing about it, compared to just YouTube videos, is that they are real courses. You know, they're structured, sometimes over an hour long, and some of them are being taught by top professionals such as Chris Burkhardt, which is one of my all-time favorite photographers. So I really recommend you to check out specifically that course. I absolutely love it. It gives you an insight on how one of the most famous photographers in the world works and his workflow, and it's just so cool to hear one of the most famous landscape photographers in the world talk about the subject. And of course there are also other courses. Now, the cool thing about Skillshare also is that you actually can get as many courses, you can watch as many courses as you would like for just about $10 a month, depending on which plan you go for. So if that sounds interesting to you and you would like to check out the course or any of the other courses on Skillshare, you can actually get a free 2-month trial to check out everything you'd like. Just be sure to use the link in the video description and use the promo code HugheFineArt. Again, make sure you use the link in the video description in order to get that free 2-month trial. So that, I think, is where I'm gonna end the video. Thank you very much for watching so long. I know it's been a very long and in-depth video, but I hope you found it helpful. So take care and keep on editing great pictures.